In this section here, we'll dive deeper into services and dependency injection, since these are more crucial Angular features every Angular developer needs to understand and needs to be able to work with. And therefore, in this section here, we'll revisit services, we'll build a new service, we'll revisit dependency injection and see what that generally is all about before we then dive deeper into these concepts and we take a look at Angular's hierarchical injection mechanism and how it resolves dependency injection requests. We'll take a look at injection tokens and values, and along the way, you will learn a lot about services and how you can provide them to different components. So let's start with services. What was the idea behind services again? Well, the idea is that services are these things, these classes that in the end can be used to share logic and data across the application. So across multiple components, for example. And to do that, you build those centralized services, which can then be injected into multiple components, but also into directives or other services, so that these components, directives, and services can use the shared logic and or data. That's the idea behind services. And to practice the usage of services, I prepared a brand new starting project, which you find attached as always, and where, as always, you should run npm install to install all dependencies, and thereafter npm start to start that development server. And once you did that, you should see this application here on the screen if you visit localhost 4200, though it's worth noting that at the moment, this application doesn't really work. We can theoretically add some tasks here, but at the moment they don't show up here in that list. And changing that filter also doesn't do anything at the moment. But that's exactly what we'll use a service for. Because in this starting application I provided to you, we have multiple task-related components that are working together. We have the new task component, which renders the form and collects the user input. And then we have the tasks list component, which has the task item component as a nested component, which in the end is responsible for outputting the tasks. And it's also responsible for managing that filter. And therefore, since we essentially have that tasks list component and that new task component that need to work together to manage these tasks, it makes sense to use such a service for managing the tasks. This also has the advantage that if we add more components to this application that needs to work with these tasks, these new components can also use the service. So managing that task's data and potentially also logic in a centralized place can make a lot of sense. And therefore here, I'll add a new tasks service that allows me to manage these tasks, so manage a list of tasks, and that will then provide these tasks to the tasks list component. And we'll build this in the next lectures. Of course, if you feel like it, definitely try building that service on your own, and maybe also try injecting it into the components that need it and use it there. But of course, it's also fine if we simply build it together over the next lectures. So let's build such a tasks service. And for that, I'll go to that tasks folder, though of course the position doesn't matter. It just should make sense logically. And since it will be a service that manages tasks, the tasks folder makes a lot of sense for storing that service file. So in that tasks folder, I'll add a new tasks.service.ts file. Again, following that common naming convention here. In that tasks service TS file, we then must export a class because services are classes. And it should be named like this: tasks service, again following that naming convention you already know from earlier in the course and also from components and directives. Now, just like components and directives, service classes also should be decorated, though there is no service decorator or anything like that. Instead, the decorator we should add here is injectable, which must be imported from Angular core. This, in the end, tells Angular that this class here can be injected into other classes, into other components, directives, or services, for example. But it's actually not just that. Instead, this injectable decorator should also typically take a configuration object where you can and should set the provided in property. And this then could be set to any platform or root. Now, I'll get back to these options a little bit later. In most cases, you want root here, which means that this service is set up such that it can be injected into any component or directive or service anywhere in your Angular application. So no matter where you want to use it, you can use it. And that's why this is the most common setting here. Now, the job of this service is to manage our tasks here, the tasks which we add with help of the new task component. And therefore, in that service, we should manage a list of tasks. And you can either manage that as an array like this, and then change it with some methods and so on, or manage it with help of a signal. Both is possible depending on the Angular version you are using. Here, I'll manage my tasks with help of a signal, and therefore I'll create a signal with the signal function provided by Angular, and I'll pass an empty array as an initial value. Now, I also want to give TypeScript some extra information about the type of values that will eventually end up in that array, though, and that's why I'll take advantage of the generic nature of this signal function and add this extra type information with help of the angle brackets here. And then between those angle brackets, we define the type of value that will be managed by that signal, and here that should be an array of tasks. And conveniently, in this starting project, I already created a task model file. It's this file here, which exports an interface which describes the shape of such a task. And it's this interface which I'm importing here, so that here I can tell Angular that this signal will manage an array of tasks. An empty array, which we have initially here, is also valid, but once we start adding items to it, it must be items that have this task shape. So that's the first step. The next step is to add an add task method, which can be triggered from inside the new task component whenever the form is submitted. So whenever this method here is triggered in the end, in that new task component. And this add task method should then receive that task data, which could be an object which has this shape, where we have a title, which is of type string, and a description, which is of type string, let's say. Alternatively, we could also, of course, accept title and description, which are both of type string, as separate arguments. This is up to you, but here I'll go for a single object argument, which has this shape. And then in here, I want to update my task's signal, or the data managed by that signal. And we can do that with tasks update, a method about which you learned earlier in the course already. Update then takes a function which will be executed by Angular. And this function will automatically receive the old tasks before the update and should then yield the new tasks. So the new tasks array that should be managed by the signal. And therefore here I'll return a new array where I spread my old tasks into this array. So I copy my old task objects into this array. And where I then also want to add a new task to this array. And I'm creating such a copy here so that I don't mutate the old array object in memory, but instead we replace it with a brand new object. When working with arrays and objects, it is typically a good idea to update data like this, where you create copies and then just change these copies instead of changing the original objects or arrays in memory. Now, regarding that new task, I'll create a new object here, and I'll start by spreading my task data into this object. So this task data object, which I receive as an argument, I spread its data, so its properties, into this new object. And then I'll add an ID as a new property, where I'll just create one with math random, which of course is not perfect, but good enough for this demo app. And I'll also set the status property here and set this to open. And I'll actually tell TypeScript that new task should be of type task to get extra type checking. So that if I had a typo here, I would get a warning from TypeScript. With that, I have such a new task object, and that can now be added to this tasks array. And that is already it. With that, I have an add task method, which updates this tasks array. And now we can therefore call this method from inside the new task component. And for that, we'll need to make the service available there. So how can we make this tasks service available in this new task component? Well, since it is a class, we can instantiate that class to create an object based on that class. That's not Angular specific, but in general, how you can work with classes in JavaScript and TypeScript. So here we could add the constructor to the new task component and also add a new private property maybe, which we could call tasks service, which should be of type tasks service. And for that, I'm importing my tasks service class here so that I can use the class name as a type. And then in the constructor, we can initialize this tasks service property by instantiating the tasks service like this. This is how we could make it available. And now in onAddTask, we could call this tasks service addTask and then pass our data like this to addTask. Or since I have equal property and value names here, I can also use this shorter notation, which is supported by JavaScript and TypeScript. That is how we could use this service. But this approach has one major problem. With this approach, we have an instance for the new task component. And if I then want to use that data and that service therefore in another component, in the tasks list component, for example, I have to create a separate instance there. And therefore, this separate instance wouldn't contain the tasks I'm adding here in the new tasks component. I would be working with two separate instances of the class, and therefore I would not be sharing data. And hence, we would have a service that is absolutely useless. That's why we want to use one and the same instance of our class object in both components. And that is where Angular's dependency injection mechanism comes into play.